In this segment, we're going to look at some progressive-era reforms. Keep in mind that these changes mostly came about through elections. One major shift was toward direct democracy. Instead of relying solely on governors, legislatures, or the president and Congress, many states implemented three key reforms: the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. You're all Californians, so this should sound familiar. Think about those campaign signs urging you to vote yes or no on various propositions. With an initiative, citizens propose a new law, and if a majority supports it, the proposition becomes law. It's a way for us to directly enact policies. Referendums work a bit differently. If the legislature passes a law the public dislikes, a referendum allows citizens to vote to repeal it. Let's imagine an initiative passes guaranteeing everyone ice cream on Tuesdays. The legislature, heavily invested in the chocolate industry, might try to overturn it. A referendum would let the people have the final say and potentially keep their ice cream rights. Finally, the recall allows citizens to remove an elected official from office before their term ends. There are ongoing attempts to recall Governor Newsom, and you might remember that Gray Davis was actually recalled, paving the way for Arnold Schwarzenegger to become governor. Direct democracy isn't without its challenges. To get an initiative, referendum, or recall on the ballot, a large number of signatures are needed. Collecting those signatures costs money, which means well-funded special interest groups can sometimes heavily influence the process. They might even write the propositions themselves. While direct democracy does give citizens more power, wealthy special interests still find ways to steer the system. It's a step forward, but it highlights the ongoing challenge of balancing direct citizen action with the influence of money in politics. Let's revisit the topic of the transformation of the U.S. Senate into what was once dubbed a millionaires' club. Initially, senators were appointed by state legislatures, a practice that, unfortunately, paved the way for wealth and influence to override public interest. This system allowed individuals to essentially purchase their seats, prioritizing the agendas of their financiers over the constituents they were supposed to represent. This changed dramatically in 1913 with the ratification of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which mandated the direct election of U.S. senators by the people. This amendment aimed to curb corruption and ensure that senators would be more accountable to the electorate rather than a select few with deep pockets. Consider the example of California. Senator Kamala Harris was elected to her position following Barbara Boxer's retirement, embodying the principle of direct democracy in action. However, when Harris vacated her Senate seat to become vice president, the process of selecting her successor harked back to pre-amendment practices. The governor was tasked with appointing her replacement, a reminder of the discretionary power state leaders held prior to 1913. A notable case illustrating the potential for corruption under the old system occurred in Illinois. When Barack Obama resigned from his Senate seat to assume the presidency, his vacated seat became a commodity. Governor Rod Blagojevich was caught attempting to sell this Senate seat, an act that led to his imprisonment. Although he was later pardoned, this incident underscores the risks associated with allowing state appointments of U.S. senators. A significant hallmark of the progressive era was the establishment of labor safeguards such as the 40-hour work week and child labor laws. Recall our discussion of the working class, the proletariat, as depicted in the film Los Mineros. We examined the harsh realities of long hours, meager wages, and a complete lack of protections for workers. This extended even to young children, some as young as 5 or 6, laboring in perilous factories and mines. While Los Mineros emphasized the role of unions in securing these changes, it's important to note that unions did not achieve substantial influence until after World War II. These protections were enacted significantly earlier, even before World War I, by progressives. Why would middle-class progressives champion the protection of workers? Certainly, child labor laws resonate with a sense of moral imperative. The exploitation of children is ethically indefensible and hinders their proper development. But from the point of view of profit maximization, there is little room for morality, and progressives were not just interested in the moral dimension. Imagine being the parent of a child lost in a mining accident. Your grief and anger would likely overshadow any sense of loyalty or productivity as a worker. Such tragedies breed social resentment. The crucial point is that workers couldn't easily escape their circumstances. Leaving a job meant destitution. This dynamic fosters social conflict and instability. If widespread unrest ensues, those who own property stand to lose everything. Consequently, progressives' interest in labor reform extended beyond mere compassion. While some were undoubtedly motivated by a sense of moral obligation, there was a strong undercurrent of economic pragmatism. Property owners desire order and predictability. A society cannot achieve stability when a large segment of the population feels deep-seated animosity toward those in power. The labor reforms of the progressive era were driven by a confluence of moral and economic considerations. Progressives, not unions, were the primary agents of change. Unions would play a vital role in later years, but during this specific period, their influence was limited. Corporate regulation, including antitrust and anti-monopoly laws, as well as railroad regulation, aims to counteract anti-consumer policies established by companies. When we consider regulating corporations, the immediate concern is often about the potential negative impact on the companies themselves. Conversely, failing to regulate them poses risks primarily to workers and consumers due to fixed prices and lack of competition. If we successfully regulate corporations, the immediate beneficiaries are consumers. However, if we delve deeper, we find that corporations also stand to gain. Regulation can lead to a more satisfied workforce, which in turn can enhance productivity and product quality. This might not translate to immediate profit increases, but it contributes to the company's long-term viability and success. Despite the potential benefits of regulation, corporations typically resist such measures due to their focus on short-term financial gains. Yet, pragmatically speaking, regulation can indeed be beneficial for them in the long run. This brings to mind the example of Henry Ford, who was ahead of his time in recognizing the value of keeping employees content. Ford introduced policies like company health insurance and limited work hours, understanding that a happier workforce would lead to higher productivity and consequently greater profits for his company. Ford's approach was somewhat of an anomaly during his time, marking a period when some American corporations acknowledged their responsibility towards the common good. However, this ethos is not universally adopted. In general, corporations prioritize their bottom line over the common good, acting in ways that maximize shareholder wealth, even if it means neglecting social responsibility. It's true that some companies still prioritize employee welfare and social responsibility, but often, these practices are adopted only when they align with the company's financial interests. Without government regulation, whether a company acts in the public interest is left to its discretion. Government regulation, therefore, ensures that corporations are obligated to consider the public good in their operations. The argument for and against corporate regulation boils down to this. Without oversight, companies might prioritize profit over social responsibility, potentially harming workers and consumers. Regulation not only protects the public interest but can also benefit corporations by fostering a stable, satisfied workforce and ensuring long-term business sustainability. Let's explore some of the social experiments associated with progressivism. One noteworthy example is prohibition. The underlying rationale was that excessive alcohol consumption had become a major problem within the working class. For example, a non-skilled laborer working at the docks might receive his wages in cash at the end of the day or week. On his way home, he might stop at a bar, drink heavily, and spend his entire paycheck. This could lead to him arriving home late, intoxicated, and a cycle of domestic violence could ensue. This pattern, coupled with the lack of income for his family, often resulted in eviction and further social instability. How did the progressives propose to address this? Their solution was to make drinking illegal entirely. The thought process was that if alcohol were outlawed, consumption would simply cease. Theoretically, this makes sense, but in reality, people continued to find ways to obtain alcohol. This led to the rise of moonshine production and hidden establishments known as speakeasies. The intended outcome was to improve people's health and happiness. However, the actual consequence was the criminalization of drinkers and the unintended creation of organized crime networks to supply alcohol. Ironically, this misguided attempt at societal improvement actually fueled the very problems it hoped to solve. Let's examine another example: anti-prostitution laws. While no federal law exists, most states have statutes against prostitution, with Nevada being a notable exception. The prevailing belief motivating these laws was that young women were often forced into prostitution for survival. This was seen as demeaning to their womanhood and humanity, as well as inherently harmful. The logic was that outlawing prostitution would eradicate the practice. However, women engaging in prostitution often did so out of economic necessity. These laws didn't change their circumstances. In fact, they exacerbated the problem. Prior to anti-prostitution legislation, prostitutes often worked in designated houses. These laws forced them onto the streets, increasing their vulnerability and exposure to danger. It's important to note, I'm not advocating for prostitution, but rather highlighting how this attempt at social regulation had unintended negative consequences. Finally, the expansion of voting rights, specifically the 19th Amendment, which granted women suffrage in national elections. Prior to this, women had gained the right to vote in state elections in a number of states, mostly in the West, but they could not vote in national elections. While the progressive movement advocated for women's right to vote, America's entry into World War I significantly accelerated the process. During the war, many patriotic men were unable to vote. They were serving overseas, and absentee or mail-in ballots were not widely available. This situation left the voting process largely in the hands of men who hadn't enlisted. It created an imbalance where patriotic women eager to participate in the democratic process were unable to do so. Granting women the vote was seen as a way to counterbalance this dynamic. This shift in perception was a critical factor in the passage of the 19th Amendment. Remember, amendments require congressional approval and ratification by 2/3 of the states. Before World War I, ratification seemed unlikely. Interestingly, some states, primarily in the South, still have not officially ratified the 19th Amendment. However, since it's federal law, they're obligated to uphold women's right to vote. Let's consider the broader impact. Who benefits from the expansion of voting rights to women? Certainly, women themselves, but the answer, in a broader sense, is everyone. A healthy democracy thrives on greater participation and representation. From a modern perspective, it can be difficult to comprehend how anyone could oppose women's inclusion in civic life. However, remember that our contemporary views are shaped by our current social context, and we must strive to understand historical events within their context. Please proceed to answer the questions in the assignment on Canvas. If you have any questions, you can post them in the open forum discussion or contact the professor using Canvas email.